In this lesson, we're going to talk about a checklist that we can use to identify issues in our own work before we decide to render it out. Okay, so I'm just starting off here in 11_begin, and I just have a few different examples to kind of talk about here as we're just talking about things to check for in your work. So many people are so ready to get their video sent off to the render queue that they forget the important step of simply watching the work back. Now, whenever you're doing a RAM preview on a really heavy file that might have a lot to watch, sometimes it's not something you want to waste your time doing. But whether or not you do it in the form of a RAM preview or you render it out and then you go ahead and watch it just in your computer's video player, you need to go ahead and just watch that before you send it off to wherever its final place is, whether you're turning it in for a project at school or a client. You need to go ahead and do this vital step of just watching your work back and taking some notes on some of the things that you need to fix. So I'm going to go over a few things that you want to watch out for whenever you're kind of going through this checklist. So I'm just going to do a RAM preview of this first composition that we're in. Now, one of the first things that I have here is my kind of little red square that animates across my screen. So the first thing that I want to look out for is to make sure that I have my motion blur turned on for animations that are going to be moving really fast, that I want to have it turned on for. Now, you may not want to have it turned on in some situations, but in this situation, kind of as we get to this last part here that's moving really quickly, it looks very choppy and it's hard to tell what's going on. So motion blur is a great way to help this to just feel more natural and realistic. So turn motion blur on for the layers that need it, and just remember to kind of turn on and off this switch here at the top as you work to kind of speed up your work while you're making things, and then at the very end you'll want to turn that on before you send it off to the render queue. Okay, the second thing I want to talk about in this same composition here is your timing. So does anything feel uncomfortably slow or fast? For me, I feel like the way that this little square is animating on is a little bit uncomfortably slow. You're just kind of ready for it to stop, and then whatever the next thing that's going to happen, you're ready for that to happen. It just feels kind of excruciatingly long. And then on the other hand, whenever this starts to move out, this is probably a little bit too quick. So if you want to change that up, you want to go in there, and in our last lesson we talked about kind of counting your keyframes and not having transitions happen that were any faster than half of your frame rate. So my frame rate in this comp is 24 frames per second. So to move forward 12 frames, I'm just going to hold shift, hit page down, and then I'll move forward 2 more frames. And then I can bring this box kind of back there, and we can watch how that transition looks. So this just feels like it gets to the point a little bit more quickly. And if you feel like this is too fast, you can always give that a few more frames to transition over, but at least it doesn't feel like it's dragging on and on. And we've moved this second to last keyframe back there so that it lasts just about a second for the transition out. So we get this pause in the middle and then it moves away. This just feels a lot more pleasing to the eye than something that feels way too fast or too slow. So now I want to talk about something else. Let's move on to our third composition over here. Just double click that third composition there in the compositions folder. And I'm going to go ahead and do a little RAM preview of this. Now you may create projects that have a couple of pieces of footage that you've kind of put together, and you have sort of an opacity fade here. And one of the common things that happens whenever you're setting those up using the opacity transform property is that sometimes you don't take opacity all the way down to 0. So I'm going to kind of zoom in here so you can see this a little bit better. And you'll notice kind of here as the opacity begins to fade out, it doesn't fade out all the way. So kind of at this point here, we still have this opacity at about 3% instead of 0. So it's still playing on top of our second clip. And sometimes this can be really hard to notice right away, because if you're just watching it through or scrubbing through really quickly, you may not see it. On this frame here, I can't see it at all anymore because that clip has ended. So if I only checked it at this one particular place in time, I would say that that looks pretty good. The only way that I would be able to see that there was kind of an opacity overlap between these two files is to watch it all the way through. So that's something you want to look out for. Just come in here to that last key, crank that all the way down there to 0. Make sure that it says 0 in the value, and then you'll be okay. You don't have to worry about it later on. Just check those keyframes. Okay, so the next thing we want to talk about is going to be this fourth one that you see here under composition. So we'll just double click that, and I'll just do a little ramp preview of this. So whenever you're creating things that have text in them, always check for misspellings. I can't tell you how many times I've made things, not checked my spelling, and it's come back to bite me. So sometimes I like to type everything that I'm going to have in my motion graphics piece out in a Word document, run spell check on it, and just make sure that I have everything spelled correctly. Now this example here, it's not actually spelled wrong, but a lot of people think that this is a word, and it's actually not. So one of the ways to get around this is just to have somebody else check your work for you. If you're having trouble with knowing, I don't know if this is spelled right, or I don't know if this is the right grammar to use for this, and you're writing your own copy, have somebody else take a look at it before you present it at its final place that it's going to be, just to make sure that everything makes sense. So just don't forget to check your spelling. That is going to save you a lot of embarrassment in the end. Now let's move on to our fifth example, just right there, the last one under composition. I'm going to go ahead and we'll do a RAM preview of this. And this is really a little bit of a subjective kind of thing to check for, but I like to do it just kind of as I watch through here. And it's really about composition. Now, I just asked myself as I kind of watched through my video, are all my compositions as interesting as they can be? And when I'm talking about composition, I'm talking about the layout from one shot to the next. So we kind of start out with a very symmetrical composition here, and then it gets pushed to something that's a lot more interesting, even though we have those same elements there from earlier. Now, if you want to learn more about composition, check out our course on composition for motion designers. You're going to learn a lot just about different ways that you can lay out things to make it more interesting, and just kind of learning some of that basic theory behind why it looks good in certain layouts. So this is just something you want to watch out for. It's going to be subjective, and at some point you just have to say, I'm ready to push this on, I'm going to render it out, and I'm happy with it. But you can always just go back and double check, make sure that you're pushing things as far as you can. Now I want to go back to our last example here, where we have this non-word kind of animating in here, and I want to talk about the 12 principles of animation. So something that's happening here is that we have kind of a little bit of follow through here. As this swings down, we see that it kind of moves back and forth. So I can take a look at the keyframes that I have here, and how much less interesting would this animation be if it simply did this? See that that just looks pretty static, boring, doesn't look realistic, and that's because it doesn't have the 12 principles of animation in place here. Now, this is only one of the principles of animation. It's going to be follow through, and that just is saying that whenever you have the physics of something like this happening, it's going to continue moving backwards and then swing back towards you. So if you want to learn more about the 12 principles of animation and how to make your animations more interesting, you can check out our course on the 12 principles of animation in After Effects. It's really great. You'll definitely learn a lot, and your animations will be better for your time. Now, there's one last thing that we can talk about here. I don't have any audio in this project, but you always want to make sure that you're checking your audio levels as you're kind of going through here, that nothing's topping out in the end. So if you come up here to Windows, you can always turn on that audio panel, and you just want to make sure that you're hovering right in this area here before it gets to the yellow. So when you're audio levels pop up, you kind of just stay at a consistent rate. So I always like to check that out at the end if I have audio in my project. Now, not always will I edit my audio in After Effects, but if I do, that's something that you want to watch out for. So in this lesson, we learned a list of some of the common things to look out for when you're finishing up your project in After Effects, and that we shouldn't be so quick to render something and call it finished if it could still use just a little more polish to make it perfect.